Alright, so picking up where I left off with this first lecture on maps and mapping and all that stuff, I'm going to talk briefly about map history. I get into more depth in some other classes, lectures, and stuff that I give. But for you guys, I just want to point out some key things here. Again, with this theme of looking at some basics, but also questioning I don't even want to say the validity of maps because maps are good. We're gonna use them. We're gonna like them and all that. But we want to know the origins of these things to get a sense of how they've evolved over the years and why we do some of the stuff that we do. And then maybe question, should we do it or do we need to do it or that kind of stuff. So with mapping, we can see this throughout history. We've got plenty of examples of maps that exist out there, and these are maps that have persevered, right? Haven't vanished, over the centuries here. There are, I'm sure, countless examples of maps that just we'll never know about because they've vanished from the archaeological record, right? But here we have two conceptions of the world. On the left, it's a medieval Europe, what's called a TO map. Quite often, because of you can see the shapes in there. You can see the letter T, see a circle, the O. But that is, if you were in medieval Europe, that was your conception of the world. Pretty impressive people, right? Brilliant cartographic skills. And so it's the idea. You see Asia at the top, and then Europe and Africa, because those were the known continents that existed. The Americas, as far as these specific people were concerned, they didn't exist. This was the entire world, right? No Antarctica, none of that, no Australia. So that was the conception of the world. And this is from where we get the idea of orienting the map, which I talked about in the last one of these lecture things, talking about, lining it up, figuring out where north is and all that stuff. So Orient, referring to Asia, right, as the Orient. And then the map here, it's setting it up so Asia was at the top. You dig? That's the whole Orient concept, why we have that term. So there's a little fun fact. Now on the right, we have a map from Babylon, so a much older map, but you can see kind of the same concept. I think what's interesting is the circle that we're dealing with, which kind of makes sense when you think about how we view the world. That if you're standing in the middle, like picture, out in the middle of the desert, just big open plains everywhere. The world is effectively, it's like a disc for us, right? Because we can turn, any of 360 degrees and just start heading out. So I think this whole idea of a circular Earth, I think it makes sense, right, from just a human standpoint. But what we'll see is we've gotten away from that concept of circles, and we'll see a lot more squares as we move on. And a lot of that comes from this guy Ptolemy, an ancient Greek fella who came up with a lot of the geography basics, the mapping basics that we'll be getting into here in the beginning of the class. But Ptolemy was a cartographer. He's kind of seen as one of the founders of modern geography, and this is his map. But we don't have the actual maps from his time period. But in the Renaissance, this stuff, and that's from when this map comes. It was actually preserved by the Muslims, the Islamic Caliphate, after Greek fell, and while the medieval Europeans were drawing these little TO circle things, folks in the Arabian Peninsula in the Middle East, they were doing hardcore stuff. They were doing actual scientific work, preserving that, and then in the Renaissance, that's taken from this part of the world and reproduced within Europe. So this is a reproduction still an ancient map right here, but this was Ptolemy's conception of the world. And so what you'll notice are a series of lines in here, right? These grid lines running through here. East, west, north, south, that's latitude and longitude. Ptolemy was the guy who came up with that stuff. I'll be talking about, I think, in the next component of this lecture. I'll be getting into, how we read that stuff. We'll be working with it in class, but that's an ancient, roughly 2,000 years old. This grid concept, and that influences a lot of how we see the world. Now we want to overlay these grid lines on here, and not to say that that's a bad thing necessarily, but it's important to realize that's just how our brains are trained to think. If we can grow up and learn in this very Western Enlightenment concept of how to properly map the Earth, and so it can be good, it can be bad. There are issues, but it's just something to be aware of. I always think back. I think I had probably mentioned to you guys that I started out in anthropology and archaeology and doing field research as well as mapping in the fields where I got my start a million years ago. But I remember at UCLA they would bring in with this one representative of the Chumash peoples. This was in an archaeology class as we're starting to learn about methods, but also ethics and things like that. This guy would come in to talk about the people who we were going to be studying in the Earth, right? Good to have that human resource, somebody who can actually speak to the people rather than us just blindly interpreting stuff we pull out of the ground, right? And this guy was fantastic because he loved to yell at us, and not in like a mean way, but he was a tough guy, but he would always shout about it. God, you white people in your squares. Nothing in nature is a square; it's all circles. But you white people, you love your squares. And as he's saying that, to all of us white people standing there listening, I mean, you couldn't help but go like, yeah, that's kind of a good point. It is. There's this imposition of trying to put squares and right angles on the landscape, when in reality, when you look at it in nature, it's not necessarily a square place, right? So again, just something to think about. Now, another key thing that I always point out to students when we're getting into this, basics and talking about Ptolemy, is not only did he start putting in these, lines running around here, but he's also the guy who really started this idea of north being at the top of the map. Now, they didn't have north in the same way we do. The Greeks actually used wind to designate cardinal direction, right? So we use, geomagnetic stuff to get northeast, southwest. All of these creepy floating heads that you see around the map here, these are the different winds. And so depending on, and it said that, even if you were like, a city slicker, even if you were some Athenian, dandy who never actually went outside, you could still detect these subtle changes in, speed, temperature, humidity, things like that. So you could tell that north wind from that south wind and the southeast wind and, that kind of stuff. That's how these people knew their direction, right? And so you navigated. Okay, so so that that's what those heads are. But we have that convention again of putting north up at the top, right? It comes from this guy. It's roughly 2,000 years old, and it's simply the case because it's what Ptolemy liked. And he was a very, aesthetically minded guy. When it comes to actual science, reason, stuff like that, sometimes that's questionable. Like for example, he was known for hating white space on the map. So if there was an area of the world that the Greeks had not gone to, explored, and gotten word of, or whatever, he would just make stuff up. Isn't that great? Isn't that adorable? He would just say, I don't know, put some mountains or shit in there, or whatever, right? That's our founder of cartography and geography and all that. He would just fill in the white space. He would just make little pretend mountain ranges or cities or whatever it might be. Okay, so that's something to think about when we, put these squares everywhere where we put north at the top. It's good to remember this comes from the guy who made stuff up all the time just to make his maps look prettier. Right? This also should be a warning to any of you like conspiracy theory folks or whatever out there, people who are you get excited about myths and things like that. Like I think of Atlantis, the idea of this thing again mentioned by the Greeks and discussed about where is it really and all that. There's a good chance a lot of the stuff was just made up. We tend to think that like these people were wiser than us and were above things like lying and pretending and sensationalism and all that. Yeah, something to think about. Okay, so there's Ptolemy. There are lines. There's our grid work, our squares. What's crazy though? Here's a map. So after Ptolemy's time, pre-Renaissance, this one's Chinese. All right, so China has had some impressive cartography as well. What I love about this is that you see the grid. You see the lines drawn on here, right? Again, it's that imposition of order onto the disordered national or natural landscape, right? So I don't want to say it's a universal thing, but it's clearly not just a white person thing. Clearly not just a Greek thing. There's a specific mindset. And what's interesting too is that if I can go really deep and all that with this grid stuff. But what's crazy about this is you look the Greeks, the Chinese. These are empires, right? That are mapping this stuff. And so empires meaning that they're growing beyond their current boundaries, right? Conquering lands, taking over that stuff. And we do see, like the Spanish were big on this, not just mapping with grids, but like when the Spanish came over to say, North America, South America, started taking stuff over, they love to put grids down on their colonial cities. You go pretty much to any Latin American city, you're gonna see this stuff, right? Or at least one that was from the Spanish conquest. Very rigid grid lines in there. Again, that imposing order, probably some connection to colonial forces here. Whereas other groups like say the Chumash that are interested in conquering the world, don't have that same order imposed. Right? Just something to think about. But the Chinese, equally impressive with their maps. There's another example here, and it's kind of what's kind of cool here. What we're looking at is you've got China. You can also see India right here. This is Africa right there, showing that they had traveled around, they had explored a lot of stuff. And what the Chinese decided, rather than like with the Greeks and the Romans and all that, who just wanted to keep growing and growing and growing, the Chinese, they started doing this stuff, and I'm like, God, the people. Once you get too far away from home, the people are garbage. And so they decided, what we're gonna do? Let's just stay home. We'll conquer this massive landmass here, but in terms of sailing across oceans and stuff like that, forget it. Those are garbage people. Yeah, something to think about. Yeah, but that's how they worked. Okay. So again, just to kind of connect this stuff, and what I want you guys to think about is that with mapping, as we think of it today, it's definitely it's got that colonial vibe to it and purpose behind it and all of that, right? Meaning that a lot of maps they were crafted for colonialism, for exploration, if you want to put it. That's kind of a more romantic way. I mean, we think of old antique maps, which are cool, great to look at, fun to look at, beautiful works of art. But they weren't produced just to be beautiful works of art. They were produced, and in many cases, it's European stuff that we're looking at, right? They're produced to help their empire continue to grow, to continue to know more about these foreign lands, to be able to take them over, to be able to control them, right? And so I simply say that not to, bash colonialism or whatever, although it's a pretty easy thing to bash. But to think about like how we view the world, how we read maps and things like that, it's based on that colonial lens. Okay? So like this map of India, what we think of as India today, now this is an older map, so it's saying the Indian Empire. What we're really looking at, we're looking at India as a British person when we look at this this map right here. So the very fact that, again, north is at the top, you can see we've got the latitude and longitude grid on here, like the way everything is set up. We're being trained to look at the earth in a specific way. There's technically no up, right? No true up. Like the North Pole isn't naturally at the top of the world or of the earth. We just think of it that way because that's what we've been trained to do, right? That looks normal to a lot of us because that's what we've just grown up seeing. Okay, now some like Indian people specifically, they've challenged this, and you can find. I love this map because it's kind of disturbing in the sense that it doesn't look quite right. But what they've done, rather than just flip the map, they've actually gone in and mapped it with south being at the top. So they oriented it in a different fashion. Okay, and so you can see we have the south arrow rather than a north arrow, but it's a totally different vibe. And usually, I mean, we could go back to this thing. I could like have that, on my wall, and I could flip it around, and so just kind of pin it up on the wall upside down as like a radical statement. Oh yeah, man, look at me, I'm crazy. But it's really not going to do much because it's just it's still upside down. It's still wrong, right? Like we're implying that we're looking at something incorrectly. Whereas this one, because they took the time to properly map it, and you can see, you can read everything. Everything is oriented with the south being at the top. When you look at that, you're not seeing it wrong. You're just seeing it differently, right? So with that, that's sad. Like we can get into Google Earth, we can mess around with stuff in here, which we may be playing with as the semester progresses. But what you can do with the little dials in the upper right there is we can easily rotate it, right? We can flip stuff around. But what you need to remember is that it's still, even though, God, that is a creepy eyeball right there. Nothing ever noticed how disturbing that is right there. At least give it, an eyelid or something and not make it look quite so menacing. But when you look at that, the north, it doesn't swap it so that now south is up here, right? It's just saying, okay, north's on the bottom now. So it doesn't quite do it. So think about that. Like as we're going through, especially as we start playing with digital maps and actually making stuff, think about how this stuff is set up, how we view the world. And why I'm bringing this up. For some of you, it's a way of saying, push back against it if you're getting into the making of maps and things like that. Like, be critical about this stuff and question what's good and what's bad and all of that. So there's kind of that radical resistance kind of vibe there. But at the same time, if you don't want to fight the man or whatever, that's fine. But if you're just simply using maps, right, for whatever it is you're doing, for out there fighting fires or doing biological, ecological research or whatever it might be, think about these conventions and how we see the world and how do those influence us. Maybe like I've had this happen out in the field, not trying to fight the man, but just like looking at a map and being there in reality, and it's really hard to take what's on the map to what I'm seeing in reality simply because that map is a bunch of squares and north is oriented and all that stuff. but the actual place where I'm standing, it just doesn't match that. And that can be difficult. So think about that as you're going around, as you're doing this stuff. Always remember these conventions, what we see, and why that is and what that means. All right, that's it for this little chunk. More to come.